Thank you for joining us. As always, I want to thank Jim and Ellie Monroe for being co-host technical coordinators for today's class. The big picture for today's class is the traditional start of the American presidential election. Last week would have been the National Party Convention for the party out of power, the Democrats. Next week would have been the Incumbents Party Convention for the Republicans. COVID-19 considerations set back the convention schedule by a month. But the traditional span of days between the National Convention and the election day cannot be changed. So where are we? Few doubts that we will remain at the high water point of the Democratic Party in this election cycle. Mr. Biden holds a near historic lead over the incumbent, and Democratic U.S. Senate candidates are within striking distance of taking back the U.S. Senate. But it's premature to assume that would continue. Last week's revelation about Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg's continuing fight with liver cancer underscores the stakes in the 2020 election, control of the Supreme Court, and the continuing changeover of judges on the federal appeals and district court. Any vacancy on the Supreme Court would take center stage in the 2020 campaign. The president's reelection prospects should receive a major boost in the next 30 to 60 days with the expected announcement of one or more COVID-19 promising vaccines or increasingly proven treatment methodologies. The president is likely to make sure that every voter is aware that a vaccine occurred during his watch. We are also witnessing a call out of federal paramilitary units to cities experiencing continuing protests over racial issues amidst an upswing in urban crime rates in many of America's largest cities. The president's executive order deploying the units is aimed at protecting federal property and monuments. But Mr. Trump now says that New York City and Chicago need a federal presence because of increased shooting incidents. Still ahead between now and Election Day are the national conventions, 3 monthly unemployment reports, and the presidential debates. Any student of history knows that there's a lot of campaigning ahead and a lot can change. As Harry Truman proved in 1948, no American election is conclusively over this far in advance of Election Day. Welcome to See How They Run Trump and the Elections of 2020. This is class 4 of this summer semester. Today is Tuesday, July 21st. Thank you for joining us for this course about how power is transferred in the American Republic. This is not a class about who should be elected, but rather about how candidates are elected. As always, I encourage you to use information and commentary presented in this class as only one of many sources to remain informed citizens of this great country. Let's begin by revisiting what may be the biggest challenge to the health of the American president's citizens, the biggest challenge to the health of the president's citizens, the well-being of the American economy, and to Mr. Trump's re-election as president. To wit, let's turn to the latest on the COVID-19 pandemic. We now know the virus cases are hitting an all-time high in many of the states across the nation. As we see the statistics every day, this is from this morning's Orange County Register, 3.7 million cases in America since the start of the pandemic, 140,000 deaths in America. The hot spots are indicated in the red areas on this map. This map is from the New York Times today, this morning, as the latest information. You can see that hot spots are generally speaking in the southern part of the U.S. and parts of many other states. Look at Idaho, for example. Soaring numbers of cases demonstrate, and the reaction by governmental entities, that normal life is still far away. And it's been reported today by the Kaiser Family Foundation that looks at healthcare issues, that wherever there has been a major upswing lately in infection, there has been almost a corresponding upswing in nursing home cases. And even though states have doubled down on trying to protect their nursing homes, that it seems that community spread, once it occurs even among populations that are asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic, it reaches the nursing homes. And the frail elderly in the nursing homes begin being targets once again. The president seems to have changed its position on masks. He put this out in a tweet yesterday. Many of you may have seen it. Some may have seen it in a positive way. Some may have seen it in a satiric way. This is actually what the president said yesterday. We are united in our effort to defeat the invisible China virus. And many people say that it is patriotic to wear a face mask when you can't socially distance. There is nobody more patriotic than me. Your favorite president. Okay. On the other hand, the White House seems at times to play down. The president seems at times to play down in his interviews and in his statements the significance of where we are on the pandemic. He described on his interview with Mr. Wallace the other day as most of the people that have it generally just have sniffles. That Dr. Fauci was somewhat overreacts. We'll have more coming out of the White House at 2 p.m. West Coast time, Pacific time, when the president and the task force reports again to the nation. The White House favorites metric now appears to be the number of deaths instead of the number of infections or the number of tests. White House says America has one of the lowest death rates in the world, and they point to charts like this to show that how the death rate has come down. But when you compare to major countries, the U.S. is hardly doing much better than Mexico or Europe on average. At best, we have done a mediocre job in controlling the deaths from COVID, despite being the world's leader in the number of cases of infection, reported cases of infection in the world. There seems to be a lot of good news. Either the pharmaceutical companies and the researchers are doing a great job at publicity, or they're making some significant progress. Just yesterday, headlines occurred: potential viruses from Oxford and a Chinese company have triggered immune responses, studies find, which would be very good in terms of dealing with COVID. The New York Times tracker of drugs and treatments shows that there's a whole lot of things in the pipeline were being used now. 2 widely used treatments, 2 with promising evidence, 10 with tentative or mixed evidence of effectiveness. Far outweigh the 5 they've identified. It's either not promising or pseudoscience or fraud. America started to reopen, and now it's starting to reverse itself. All those states in gold are reversing their reopening of their economy, including, obviously, our state. However, those in blue, particularly in dark blue, are essentially, their economies are essentially reopened, including such big states as Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Iowa. So it depends where you are, how you see this oftentimes. Even Georgia is still reopening. Of course, that belies its infection rates. Governor Newsom has reversed course in terms of either pausing or reversing back to on which elements of the economy can reopen. Yesterday, he allowed outdoor haircuts and personal care under certain conditions in the most impacted areas of the state, the most populated areas. But we know that some things have been shut down completely, like the Rose Parade announced that they weren't going to wait to determine whether or not January 1 would be, they could do the Rose Parade. It's off for the year. They have recycled through. The youth sports yesterday announced the schedules that would have some training for traditional sports like football delayed until early December. Now, it's not all COVID news. The Supreme Court, before it recessed for the summer, but not recessed for business, gave the president a setback on his taxes, though that setback will probably not affect the disclosure of those taxes before the election day. The president's lawyers and the Justice Department had a high bar to match. They were claiming almost absolute immunity from Congress or even grand juries, and the courts clearly didn't want to go that far, and they provided some guidelines for future requests of all presidents. Justice Roberts wrote, somewhat, ironically in part, that we've gone 200 years and we haven't had a case like this reach the Supreme Court between Congress and the president, and between the president and grand juries. We must be in an interesting and unusual time to have gone this far without this happening. Some columnists say, well, the Democratic Congress overreached and will now have controls on how it can do it under the Supreme Court rulings. Others say that, okay, legitimate restraints on legislative inquiries probably should be a bar to inquiries against the president on personal matters, financial matters. Ruth Bader Ginsburg hospitalization and then revelation about her medical condition is not only an issue of tremendous significance on a personal level, but significance on a jurisprudence level and political level. I cannot see any way that if she leaves office, either through resignation or through death, that won't become the dominant political issue of this election cycle. And I don't doubt for a second that the Senate Majority Leader would schedule hearings. Now, whether he could complete those hearings before Election Day or in a lame duck session of Congress after Election Day, there's enough time left to do it. Now, it's not traditional to do it that way, but I think he would be under tremendous pressure to do it, particularly if his party loses control of the Senate. This was done last week in the Washington Post. 4 things that could swing the 2020 race towards Trump. Number 1, Supreme Court vacancy. The other 3 are issues like moving from public opinion polls that are based upon registered voters to likely voters, flubs from Mr. Biden as he campaigns, and maybe some good news on the coronavirus front. When you think about the court, think about this, that of all the active federal judges, 1/4 have now been appointed by Mr. Trump. 1/4. But take another 4 years and that percentage goes way up. If you look at the number of appeals court justices, another very high percentage now from the Mr. Trump and Senator McConnell's sponsorship. Oh, you might have forgotten the last 2 weeks, something else happened. Roger Stone got his sentence commuted. It wasn't formally pardoned, that is, that his conviction is still on the record. But the penalties, all the penalties, including supervised probation, a monetary penalty, and time to be served behind bars, all were commuted to 0. Senator Romney is definitely not going to be on the Trump Christmas list anymore. Christmas card list called it historic corruption, the decision to commute Mr. Stone. Robert Mueller became unsilent, at least in writing, to strongly defend his inquiry and why Mr. Stone was tried and why a jury found him to be guilty of lying to federal investigators and lying to Congress. Now, the Wall Street Journal, I think, correctly points out presidents and governors using their executive authorities have done some really bad pardons and commutations. And President Clinton certainly had some real classic ones, some that seemed to be unexplainable to this day on why he made those appointments. So, yeah, Mr. Trump should be held accountable for his decisions, pardons, and commutations, but he is in a strong tradition, at least some presidents, in the persons who have been commuted. Remember, Robert E. Lee was pardoned by I think it was Gerald Ford, or George H.W., one of the presidents along that era. Okay, by the way, hardly any news has focused on some international affairs, like the new North American trade agreement is now in place. And, President of Mexico came up to celebrate it. He even talked about how good of a friend Mr. Trump is. The Taliban continues to attack Afghani forces as we continue to withdraw troops from Afghanistan. Major U.S. naval action to project power against the Chinese in the South China Sea, in the sensitive areas in the South China Seas, the critical sea lanes. Again, very important issues, been completely overshadowed in the news. What isn't being overshadowed, because the president won't allow it to be overshadowed, and because of its significance, is an upswing in violent crime in American cities. Not all American cities, but many large American cities. In Milwaukee, Philadelphia, New York, Chicago, and Atlanta are just some examples. Mr. Trump says it's because of Democrats running their cities in a stupid way. And the president, on his command, through his executive order, sent in federal paramilitary forces from law enforcement agencies with the service from which they came from, whether it be immigration and naturalization or in any of the federal law enforcement agencies. You don't know because the unit is not displayed. They are there to defend federal property and to pursue people that are threats to federal property. That's a wide mandate. The mayor of Portland asked that the federal officials take their paramilitary out of his town, and to which the acting head of the Homeland Security said, nope, we need to be here. President announced that he's sending into additional cities, including Chicago, not only to defend federal property, but because of the high degree of violence and gunshots. Democratic officials are complaining about this provocation. They see these paramilitary forces stimulating violence rather than suppressing violence. Those on the left have editorialized with such commentaries as this one: Trump's occupation of America's cities have begun. Protesters are being snatched from the streets without warrants. So let's talk about some of this news, whether it be COVID, the paramilitary responses. Do you think, try to answer this question, if you would. Does any of this big news move the needle on this election? On either they're really kind of good news for Republicans, as bad as the news might be, or good news for Democrats? And are the American media gatekeepers and the American people losing track of what may be really significant things happening on the international level?
I don't see anything on the list that's going to move the needle, unfortunately. I think that, you know, if Biden's flubs become an issue, all we have to do is show any press conference or any public speech that Trump's ever given and just articulate his flubs, which are ubiquitous. I think that for me, and maybe many of the Republicans, the militarization of police and the federal takeover of cities, whatever the cause, is a little bit too much of shades of Germany in 1939. And I think that that's going to alarm people more than anything else that's on the table, international or local. Thank you.
As far as our president's, not pardoning Stone, but commuting Stone's conviction, does this mean he's going to have a hard time finding a job? Is this going to be stuck to his record, and every time he applies for a position, that this is going to mean something bad is going to happen? You know, he's going to be denied that. I don't think so. That's another one of Trump's things that he does to sidestep any of the questions that are relevant to the American people. But we have a new entity here that's very dangerous. He found a way to have a new federal police force that he can send anywhere, anytime that he chooses. And this is a combination of all federal agencies. We have no idea who these people are, what their mandate is. All we know is that he put them together and he sends them to wherever he wants. Now, this is a very dangerous position. So that means that during election day, he can say that, a state that he is going to probably lose, he's going to send federal troops in there and say, well, this is a dangerous situation and we have to maintain order here. And everybody stay home. I mean, this is something that's not unbelievable. This guy will do anything. I mean, even when that he is defeated, he's not going to accept that defeat. He's not going to leave office without a fight.
Okay, let's talk about the presidential election. There's a presidential election. Some information on the election. Mr. Biden and Democrats had a big second quarter fundraising effort with which succeeded very well, narrowing the cash gap with the Trump campaign. That's probably indicative of two things. One, Mr. Biden is consolidating the Democratic Party, getting fundraisers from the various elements of the Democratic Party. And two, his chances look relatively good, and people like to contribute to a winner. And probably three, people who are opposed to Mr. Trump have a convenient place to put their money now. So I think it's good news to the Biden campaign. Remember, last week would have been the Democratic convention. So this shows that, at least in terms of money, that Mr. Biden is substantially consolidating Democratic Party support. Mr. Trump, however, got some good news, and that is because of the shutdown in many parts of the country, voter registration is way down from traditional levels at this time. And the Republican Party has a slight edge in terms of that. And that could have some, as I say, many elections are decided not on the issues or even the candidates, on structural issues. Who does the best job in getting their voters registered and to the polls and motivated. So that's good news for the president. Also good news for the president was the U.S. Supreme Court decided not to get involved in the Florida ex-felons case, in which the ex-felons who were granted by voters in a ballot measure 2 years ago, the right to vote if they meet certain standards. Well, the legislature created some, which some believe is high standards, others think are adequate standards, including payment of fees and fines, and those who won't be able to vote. And the Supreme Court decided not to get involved in that, leading that to state decision making and not federal decision making. Other campaign news, let's talk about the Electoral College. We have a couple of rating services have come out with their updated ratings for the Electoral College. And the University of Virginia Center for Politics says that Democrats, meaning Mr. Biden, if the election was held right now, would have 268 electoral votes to Mr. Trump's 204, too short of the 270 needed. The Cook Political Report is more bullish on Mr. Biden, saying that if the election was held today, 279 electoral votes. The first time in this cycle that Mr. Biden has gone over the 270 mark in the Cook forecast to Mr. Trump's 187. The difference between the two is essentially Virginia. I mean, strike that. Wisconsin. Wisconsin in the Cook report is placed within lean Democratic and in the forecast. This is the Cook report. This is the Cook numbers. I think I can even do a close up on that. The Cook numbers. The top of the states being Arizona, Florida, Georgia, and North Carolina. The now lean Democratic states are the Midwest states of Michigan and Minnesota and Wisconsin, plus the second congressional district. Nebraska splits their electoral votes among congressional districts. New Hampshire and Pennsylvania, that some say votes like a Midwestern state, even though it's borders on the East Coast. Leaning Republican states, Iowa, the 2nd Congressional District in Maine, Ohio, and Texas, but not out of reach for Democrats. So no matter how you look at it, Cook tried a variety of graphics. They said, what if we just put the states by their electoral votes in a mason jar? Where would Mr. Biden's total be? Well, you can see that Mr. Trump's jar is not full, and Mr. Biden's jar is full. Not surprisingly, that's where the two campaigns are spending money now, in those states. And if you look at the difference between what the president's campaign and the is spending in the battleground states and what Mr. Biden was spending, you can see the president is all in on Florida, all in on Pennsylvania, all in on Wisconsin, all in on North Carolina. Well, Mr. Biden is starting to spend some big money in Florida and in Arizona. Remember, Arizona's a smaller state than Florida, so money goes farther away. Particularly into Michigan, Mr. Biden is in, and is spending a fair amount of money in Pennsylvania, and is actually outspending Mr. Trump in Wisconsin. Hillary Clinton, who never campaigned in the general election in Wisconsin, that mistake, and it's considered a mistake, may or may not have been, but it's at least considered an election mistake. Mr. Biden apparently is committed not to make that mistake in either his spending or how his campaigns. Let's move on. Let's talk about the actual horse race, down a little bit more finite between the guys. How do you campaign? Mr. Trump has tried some in-person events and had to cancel some. And now it's how do you campaign in social media? And this is an area that President Obama did quite well in, and then Mr. Trump did very well in the last election cycle, and looks like to many analysts is still doing quite well in terms of mobilizing social media. But Mr. Biden is trying to compete more effectively now. Last weekend, Mr. Trump started to use tele-rallies, half-hour tele-rallies on Facebook Live. He held it for supporters in Wisconsin, aimed at supporters in Wisconsin, Arizona, Michigan, North Carolina, spread across 3 days. How you do that, you can buy through Facebook, geo-coded data. So you want to outreach to people in Wisconsin. You want to outreach to those people and geocode it like ads to those folks. Polling. Well, if the Electoral College is showing good news in the expert analysts, that must be based upon polling, and indeed, the polling is very strong. As of yesterday, the consensus polls, the polls of polls, if you would, taking into account methodology differences and likely voters versus registered voters only. When you compare to apple, Mr. Biden, as of the polls yesterday, evaluated yesterday, 8.8% up. But that's down 1% from the last time we met a week ago. So Mr. Trump appears to close the gap 1%. The most recent polls, if you look at those, Fox News had Mr. Biden up 8%, ABC, Washington Post up 11%, depending upon how and the date of the polls. Earlier today, 5:38, one of their analysts said, what were the polls like 105 days to election day, which we are now, 105 days? Well, let's go back. Mr. Trump was up 3.6% 4 years ago at this time, Mr. Obama was up 0.2% in his reelection, 4.1 in his election. You can see that Mr. Biden's lead is significant. You have to go back to George W. Bush's first term against Mr. Gore to see such a comparable lead by one major party nominees. Where the president is truly hurting is the public perception of his coronavirus response. He went from, in March, having a plurality of support, 45 to 43, in terms of handling the coronavirus, to a deficit of 54% of respondents believe Mr. Biden, who has said, you know, as much as you might expect, but hasn't been responsible for the management of the response. 54% that he would do better, just 54% compared to 34% who believe this is how Mr. Trump actually did. And the economy, Mr. Biden keeps closing the gap on the economy. Keep closing the gap. Again, we talked about this before. What's motivating voters? Voting against Mr. Trump, voting for Mr. Trump. Not necessarily voting against Mr. Biden or voting for Mr. Biden, it's Mr. Trump. Lots of evidence. So you read about, well, it's the secret Trump voters that are not telling pollsters where they stand. Because, as we all know, Trump voters like to not state their views. Consequently, and that's a joke, what about these secret or shy Trump voters? Do they exist? Probably. Do they exist in large number? Maybe not, and probably not. Detailed analysis of national polls 4 years ago suggests that if they existed not in states such as California, in which you would think that the large number of anti-Trump voters would make people shy. Actually, in California, the polls understated the Clinton vote. If the polls are adjusted to try to go after what they call hard to find voters, or if you just looked at the Electoral College, the close margins in the swing states, you would still see a very substantial lead by Mr. Biden. And you can see how that would change when you extrapolate certain polls. Arizona becomes very close, so with North Carolina and Wisconsin, but still with a leaning Biden. To go after the hard to find voters, that is voters who don't, who might not vote in this election, but would be those voters that might be attracted to Mr. Trump. Again, Mr. Biden seems to be well positioned at this moment in time. So, another way of looking at this enthusiasm issue is, who has the enthusiasm issue problem? Is it Mr. Trump or Mr. Biden? Well, an argument can be made is that Mr. Trump has the enthusiasm problem because his net enthusiasm is negative. So if you go into to a swing area and campaign, you'll stimulate your supporters traditionally. But the downside is, how much do you stimulate your opponents? And so far in this election cycle, the polling seems to suggest campaigning in certain in areas, it stimulates Mr. Trump's enthusiasm and Mr. Trump's opposition. Mr. Biden has a net enthusiasm rating of -3. Mr. Trump has a net enthusiasm rating of -22. That's it. Think about dating. If you're dating and you ask the people you're dating, well, you know, how did you like him or her? Well, okay. Oh, that was a disaster. Think about the difference between the two enthusiasm ratings. Okay, let's look at Mr. Trump campaign, then we'll have another discussion period. Why Mr. Trump's campaign decided to double down on going after Director Fauci, who knows? It's hard to imagine. The president said one thing, that he likes the doctor, but he doesn't always take the doctor's advice. He's a little bit overactive. His minions in the White House, including his trade advisor, went actively after the leading infectious disease expert in the U.S. government, at least in the National Institute system. Why do you do that for political purposes? Why? Democrats, of course, push back very hard. It's not hard defending someone who has been on the front line of infectious disease control. I mean, that's like a lawyer would love to have that person as a client. Even the Wall Street Journal just kind of scratched their heads. They called it Mr. Trump's non-message. Wall Street Journal, this is a mess. And if it continues, Republicans will be routed in November. Leaning into a cultural war against experts won't win undecided voters. Americans want a realistic assessment, which is that infections are not going to be eliminated in the U.S. in the immediate future, but that does not justify the public health and economic harm of indefinite lockdowns. If the administration had said that, there would likely be virus flare-ups in parts of the country amid reopenings and civil unrest. Fewer Americans would have been caught by surprise. Today, President Trump's opponents can depict the White House as resigned, lacking direction, and more eager to disparage medical authorities than rally them to implement the administration strategy. Time is running out to change that perception. Not a strong endorsement of the president's messaging efforts in this campaign. And of course, we talked about his ratings on the coronavirus. And today at 2 our time, the president is going to do, as I think the LA Times called it, a second season of the White House task force with its reality star, the President of the United States. And we'll see how he'll do. Can he turn it around? Are people too polarized already? They won't believe him. Any good news, they won't attribute to him. Any bad news, they'll attribute to him. The worst of all worlds. You're the spokesperson. They attribute the bad things to you, but not the good things to you. Karl Rove, who knows something about being in the White House, said, Mr. Trump, by turning so-called Rose Garden events in the White House grounds into campaign events, is violating the first rule of the presidency, and that is use your incumbency to rise above politics, even when you are playing politics. And Mr. Trump hasn't learned that rule, according to Mr. Rove. Probably something else he hasn't learned too, but I don't see the advantage, and we should talk about this, of defending Confederate monuments. What's the advantage in the swing states of Pennsylvania, of Wisconsin, of Ohio? The American people 2 years ago were not ready to remove statues. 35% for removal, 63 leave in place. Let sleeping dogs lie. Look at that now. 51%. And I think rising in terms of Confederate statutes as the military continues to weigh in on that issue on a military basis, and as more known about the Confederate general. Campaign can't be going well if you fire a campaign manager, rule number 2. Rule number 3, if you spend $983 million, more than any other candidate ever for the presidency, you should be doing better than being behind 9 points in the polls. Shaking up your campaign won't help if the problem is the candidate. Rule number 3 in politics. President wants to double down on a number of attacks, but he hasn't decided which one works best. Does he attack Biden on economy, pointing to how the stock market continues to do very, very well? Or is he a Trojan horse for a radical agenda? He's just an instrument of AOC. Or is he a party of socialism and worse than socialism? What is Mr. Biden? Or is the American way of life not safe with Mr. Biden? Don't allow Mr. Biden to take the American way of life on a date. Or is he a threat to the suburban communities, not only in terms of racial integration, but in other terms like defunding the police departments in suburbia or in urban areas, forcing the crime into your neighborhoods? During a town hall earlier this week, Mr. Trump noted about Mr. Biden, they're going to bring people, eliminate single-family zoning. They want to eliminate single-family zoning, bringing who knows into your suburbs so that your communities will be unsafe and your housing values will go down. So what's the story? What is the theme of this campaign of Mr. Trump? Is it to relitigate desegregation in the 60s and 70s? What is this? And let's talk about that now. Let's talk about, what about these attacks on Mr. Biden? It's an old rule in politics. If you believe you can't win based upon the merits of what you've done, make sure that your opponent is perceived as worse. That you're the lesser of two evils. So is it the culture war campaign that you want to fight against your opponent? The desegregation of the suburbs? That you are a passive figure that will be run over by the Trojan horse people, the Elizabeth Warren, the AOCs, the Bernie Sanders? Or are you someone like so many Democrats in the president's view, unable to control urban anarchists? What is this campaign? What should this campaign be about in order to be successful? And I turn it back to you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I did want to comment that I know somebody that lives in Portland, and the militarization of the police force up there, when they put the gas out, it wasn't just pushing the protesters away. It invaded the homes of the people in the residential area all around there. And it affected people with asthma, with respiratory diseases, and other effects. And so it's not just the people that are being the protesters, it's everybody in the community is being affected by this invasion of paramilitary people. Well, and then that got me thinking. I think that militarization matters in the urban centers, but they're not the voters that vote for Trump. So it's not really going to move that needle. But I do think that disparaging Biden is going to, I don't think that's going to win this presidential election for him. Biden has a history in the Congress. He's got history in the news. He's, you know, he's nice looking. He's a family man. People have been trying to expose dirt on him for years and years, and it hasn't come up yet. So I think that I think he'll shoot himself in the foot if he takes that fear mongering, which appeals to his base. They like being fearful, I guess, but I don't think it's going to appeal to the swing voters at all.
Thank you.
Re the last federal troops issue. one of the lawyers on MSNBC said that when all of the states put themselves in a state of national emergency, it opened it up for Trump to be able to do that. And none of us have changed that.
The president is using the state of emergency authority, as
Yeah.
presidents have done in the past on other issues, and this is the legal justification.
Yeah.
And probably substantially will have a fairly good legal case, but we'll see how the court systems. Usually, the court systems give great deference to the executive on public emergencies.
The question I have is, why are we talking about Portland? You know, in the scheme of things, it's Portland. And what I think is going on is always these diversions from the real important things of the day. It's the pandemic, it's the economy, it's international affairs. And so what we're doing is being manipulated for the 24-hour news cycle so they can show the reruns on Fox News continuously. And so that's what's going on, whether it's the Confederate flags or whether football players kneel or not. Those aren't even important. It's just being, you know, it's just diversions. And so I really don't like it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, is that all we got on this one? Okay, let's go back. We got a lot more we can cover today and plan to cover. So let me go back. Okay, Mr. Biden's campaign. Sooner or later, he'll be the Democratic nominee. He certainly has enough pledge votes. Sooner or later, that convention in a month will be held and he'll have the formal legal designation. But he's campaigning, and he has been campaigning for 2 months as the presumptive Democratic nominee. So we should consider him in effect in that role. He spent a lot of time in the last few weeks on trying to come up with his economic platform for this election, knowing that it's going to be picked apart by his opponents and his supporters. His supporters, some of which may think he doesn't go far enough, and his opponents thinking that he is a raving socialist. So trying to get that economic program between to at least consolidate the Democratic not only base, but the Democratic Party has been a challenge. He's outlined it in a number of policy statements. They are in detail on his website. They're in so much detail they're going to be picked apart on Mr. Trump's campaign website. He's put out a climate plan, an audaciously cost climate plan of $2 trillion. Wall Street Journal points out he's put out a lot of expensive plans on healthcare, on infrastructure, on pre-K education, on K-12 education, on higher education, on housing, on expanding Social Security, on paid family leave, as well as a plan to finance, at least in part, those expenditures. And he's done something Mrs. Clinton never got, Secretary Clinton never got done well, and that is reaching agreements on key issues with the Sanders wing of, or at least Bernie Sanders' key supporters. Not necessarily all his grassroots, but his key supporters, including Bernie Sanders. If you go on the website of the Biden campaign, a series of documents are posted there indicating various policy issues in which there's a consensus among the wings of the Democratic Party. This one is just a shortened one. There was a lot of detail between the beginning and the end of this. I just shortened it, cut and pasted it. But I wanted to show you who was on the climate crisis environmental justice task force. John Kerry, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, And is it enough to say anymore? The two wings of the Democratic Party. Two wings of the Democratic Party. So let's discuss for a moment Mr. Biden. Is Mr. Biden going too far in trying to placate the left wing of the Democratic Party? Too big government of approach will scare away people once the price tag, either in terms of spending or the price tag in terms of added revenues and taxation. Will that scare voters away? What do you think? Think about it from a political perspective. Not that is Mr. Biden campaigning in the Democratic primary, Mr. Biden campaigning in the November general election after those swing votes in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. And we switch back for comments.
I'd like to address something that Biden can do that is impossible for Trump, and that is empathy. The United States, so many people are scared, people are losing their jobs, they're hurting. Biden is a person who has lost a wife and 2 children that he's buried. This is a person who has the ability to address the emotional content and feeling of the nation in a way that Trump will never, ever be able to copy. And I think that that is going to play a major role in the coming election. I'm done.
I think the proposals that Biden has put forward shows the direction he wants to go in. But every one of us listening to this knows that the platforms, the proposals, everything that they put forward is not going to happen. None of it ever does happen, just the way it's laid out. And so I don't think it's going to have that much of an influence on people's decisions other than to show the direction that he's heading toward. And I'm hoping that people will respond to that. And I want to agree with Marilyn on empathy. That was the word that came to me earlier. When you contrast the personalities of the 2 candidates, to me, that is, I'm not going to go to Trump. Apart from everything else, Biden cares for people. And the same cannot be said of Donald Trump.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, let's talk about reopening schools. The president put down a marker that he wants the schools open. Remember, he wanted the economy open by Easter at one point. But he's put down a marker on reopening schools, including having his Secretary of Education be a leading spokesperson for him on that, and allege some consequences if schools aren't open fully. And of course, the schools opening has several practical impacts, obviously, apart from politics. Education, probably the biggest one, right? The economy, because if you move children out of schools, more caregivers can do at least part-time jobs. Some first responders have been hobbled because they're doing caregiving at home to their children. And people say they would love to have their children back at school, even when they express reservations about the safety of kids going back to school. So reopening schools is a test in itself. Why the president has decided to make this a campaign issue instead of letting this just play out and pick up the pieces as they start playing out. Being a facilitator instead of a leader on this issue is interesting to me. And why the president or the vice president would get into the dispute with the CDC over guidelines to open schools safely boggles my imagination. Yes, Mr. Trump believes that there's a conspiracy among the National Education Association, unionized teachers, and Democrats that somehow keep kids back in schools in order to drag down the economy and to over-dramatize the impact of the virus. I don't know if he's been successful as of yet in being able to be convincing in that area. By the president putting down a marker on opening schools, every action in politics has a reaction. Coming in so strong on that had some Democrats come in strongly in the other direction. Instead of having this worked out on a local school district by school district basis. California had a plan put out in June. It was prescriptive in some part and suggestive in other parts. The more school districts looked at it, looked like, well, you should consider this. You should consider that. You should do this and that. And some school districts say, fine, we go ahead and start doing our processes. Others say, I want more detail. I'm a superintendent of schools. I'm not a health officer, a public health officer. Tell me what you want to do so I can at least say I like it or I don't like it. Don't make me do it. Orange County Board of Education with very little authority over school districts on reopenings. A lot of financial oversight authority, a lot of special ed on county-run schools authority, on special education schools run by the county in some areas. Orange County School Board of Education came out, let's send the kids back without masks, without social distancing. That didn't last very long when local school districts in Orange County started to go in, at least the larger districts, in the opposite direction. Some of the smaller, more homogeneous districts did embrace reopening, at least in some manner. Teachers almost, or representatives have been pretty unanimous. They don't want to bring back the teaching staff and the students until they believe the schools are safe. Though, there's the public schools and then there's the private schools. And the private schools seem to be headed more towards reopening, particularly the wealthy private schools, towards reopening their campuses. So the governor last Friday came down with, well, you want a lot of the school districts wanted more specifics. Here's some more specifics. You can't open in the most impacted counties, encompassing 90% of the population in California, unless you meet certain standards and for at least 2 weeks, with one big exception I'll talk about in a moment. And so school districts went back and started to retool their plan. The exception is this. There's a footnote pointed out by EdSource this morning, that there's a footnote in the guidance for schools and school-based education that would allow elementary schools to open particularly K-6 elementary schools under standards. A waiver may be granted by the local health officer for elementary schools to open for in-person instruction. A waiver may only be granted if one is requested by the superintendent or equivalent for charter or private schools in consultation with labor, parent, and community organizations. Local health officers must review local epidemiological data, consider other public health interventions, and consult with the state when considering a waiver request. In other words, if you can get a deal among the stakeholders, the teachers, the parents, everyone, there's a way of opening K-6. And I think in private schools, you may get there faster than in public schools. Orange County schools now You know, at least according to press reports, all going to start online. My school, the school district I'm in, are going to start online and virtual. Now, there's a good public policy issue is, should they? Has this become so politicized that we need to look at the evidence, or at least the evidence gathered thus far? And this is not, at least in my view, and I'd like your input on this as we discuss this, of course, not as nearly as clear cut. There seems to be substantial evidence, perhaps convincing evidence, that schools are opening with proper social distancing in low infection areas in other parts of the world seem to open okay thus far. Of course, we don't have a whole lot of evidence of what happens on a long term. The National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine advocates school districts should prioritize reopening, especially for grades K through 5, and with students with special needs, because the impact of the education outweighs the risk of any infection. In other words, it's still dangerous, but the reward provides a much greater benefit. Though upon examination, the American Academy of Pediatrics moved back a little bit, saying that schools in areas with high rates of coronavirus infection shouldn't be required to open against the advice of local experts. The Economist magazine recently wrote, the risk of keeping schools closed far outweighs the benefits in their view. And I thought it was a reasoned view. I think most would say that schools have to reopen. How you do it is a big undertaking. And we've wasted perhaps a lot of time in getting to this moment. You can't talk about reopening schools or remaining virtual for the millions of kids in California and the tens of millions of kids across America without thinking about the alternative. And while virtual education has improved and there's considerable assurances in this state and the nation that it has over its initial implementation in March, there are likely to be many millions of kids that are not well served by virtual education. Not well served because of lack of technology, lack of parental assistance. The kids who are home, the older kids who are home are taking care of other kids. The lack of reliable connectivity, you just name the issue. The difficulty of the curricular matter, teaching reading more difficult than helping someone advance in math that's already in a certain math progression. So just because the president has made this an issue that it should be reopened doesn't mean that schools should stay closed for a long time. And just because Democrats and allies of Democrats like teachers unions point out practical issues in the reopening, critical practical issues, doesn't mean that that considerable effort and money and resources should not be applied. They must be applied before this is successful. But it's going to cost money to reopen under the best of circumstances. One's a study of just a small school district, and this seems like almost peanuts considering the trillions of dollars we've been talking about. Just for a small school district, it could be a couple $1 million. One estimate was 1.7 million. That's just for, for hygiene and other elements to make the schools safe. You got to have that money. Got to have that money. So part of the fourth coronavirus effort being made in Congress, fourth financial package, is providing enough money to help schools get to a point where those that reopen have the wherewithal to effectively implement the safe reopening. It's hard to reopen schools on a lesser budget than you have now and do all the hygiene. You can say you're going to do it, but can you sustain it? That is a very considerable issue that needs to be well thought through. And let's before we chat on this, let's talk about, guess what? Kids don't live alone. Kids live with adults, and kids live with older adults in at least 4.1 million cases in America in which younger kids live with elderly persons. So that you can't divorce one thing from another when you talk about community spread of disease. Remember what the Kaiser Family Foundation pointed out in terms of outbreak states are also areas in which elderly in nursing homes had a resurgence of infection and hospitalization and death. Just so you know, it's just not America. Israel has had very active protests about reopening schools too soon. The Netanyahu government moved quickly to reopen the schools. There's been substantial pushback in Israel. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about it. We could talk all day about whether or not it's a good idea. When do you do it? How do you phase it? You got to do it sometime. How do you reassure parents to give parents an opt-out for a year that you can do virtual education for a year if you are concerned about the health and if you believe that the schools can't provide a healthy environment, that we won't enforce the mandatory education requirements in the schools during that period. But let's talk about the politics of it first. Who has the best political position on the school reopening now, Mr. Trump or the Democrats? Democrats say when it's safe, and let's give you a lot of money so it can be safe. Regardless of your politics, would you want to send your grandchildren to school in their school district now, or by the end of September? Would you want them to start? And what about secondary schools and colleges in which the transmission appears to be between young adults and older adults seems to be more of a likely phenomenon than between younger kids?
I'm an academic, so I obviously believe very strongly in education. But here's the conundrum, especially with the youngest of students, students from kindergarten all the way up through sixth. As best as you can separate children in the classroom from a safe distance, it's like herding cats. Children between classes are going to be together. All it takes is just a few systemic students to spread it throughout the other student body. When they go home from the school to their home, they're out in the public in one form or another. When they reach home, there's at least one generation, perhaps two generations of parents and grandparents living there. But focusing on just the parents alone, if the parents now become victims of the virus because their children brought it home, a lot of these people, the parents, are now going to be sick and not able to go to work. Because they can't go to work, this will have a negative effect on the economy. And then, of course, obviously with grandparents, they're even more susceptible, like people our age. So that's going to cost a lot of money. to treat these people. So that's the conundrum. I believe in education, but there are going to be consequences, both financially as well as medically. Thank you.
Thank you.
You know, I hate to say this because it sounds prejudiced, but the president has done nothing that's been scientifically based. So why we would go with him for this is wrong. I truly believe that children learn best at school. There's no way that they learn at home than they do at school. However, we have noticed an increase in the number of the virus in young children now. That's scary. And we know that every time we have changed the rules and allowed for more interaction, there's been an increase in the rate of problems with the virus among people. So given all that scientific information, I think what we need to do is hold back, wait until it's safe for everybody, and then let the kids go to school. I know that it's going to be bad. I've seen what happens over summer semesters when the kids are not in school and how much they lose between what they had in the fall and what they had in the spring. So I'm for kids going to school, but not now.
Good.
Thank you.
Isn't it ironic? And we're going to kind of end on this point so everyone can talk on this, because I think it's an important thing. I don't want to give it short shrift. But I do want to make one point, and that is this. We may get to the point in which we get to an effective treatment methodology and a vaccine before we could solve these problems. And we would have spent trillions of dollars and spent maybe a year in just kind of in limbo, proving to fellow Americans that we can't get something right. We don't seem to be on the same page long enough. We have leadership at all levels that some unite, some don't unite. Wouldn't that be terrible? We just couldn't get this right, but thank goodness the scientists and the people in pharmacology, if people get the vaccines once they're there, of course, that may be another issue. Anyway, let's continue the talk on this. Mary Sampson's next, I think.
I'm really glad that I'm a retired high school teacher now. When I think of the 160, 165 students who pass through my classroom on a daily basis, it just makes me gasp. That's 160 people bringing whatever germs they've been exposed to at home and from each other. And then they leave the class and mingle in the hallways and sidewalks of a school, go to their lockers. And I've heard one suggestion that the teachers rotate into another room rather than the students. Well, that's all very well and good, but teachers have a lot of, for want of a better term, stuff in their personal classrooms. And to have to pack up papers to be returned, papers collected, textbooks that they're using, basic teacher equipment, and go to another room, that's tremendously time consuming too. And plus you're going to be seeing other students that you would have seen in your personal room anyway. And then they all bring those germs with them. And many teachers, in fact, a good many personnel in high schools, since that's what I'm most familiar with, are over the age of 50. And that includes not only teachers, but adult aides, janitors, people who are support personnel.
Yeah.
And it's just not going to be good.
I think of what my dentist told me when I went to the dentist a week ago, and he said, we look at every person coming in the door as someone that is carrying an infection. And that's how we have to organize ourselves. So what you're saying, Mary, about looking at, particularly at this time, if you were teaching, everyone that comes into contact with you, student, fellow staff member, support, peer, that that person, there's a chance that you, at least a risk that you're taking in interaction with. Go on to Jim Monroe.
Yeah, I thought the presentation in the discussion was really good. But the thing that bothers me is I think what's going on, like in the White House, is, hey, I got to get reelected. Hey, the economy's got to do better. Hey, you can't get the economy going unless you get schools going. So let's get schools. We'll threaten to cut off their funds, and we'll send Betsy DeVos off on talk shows. I'm not sure how our democracy survives this kind of process. That's my problem. Thank you.
Thank you. But even in my school district that I'm in, a parent questionnaire found that at least 30% of parents didn't want to send their kids back under any condition this school year. So that what do you do with a public education system in which 30% believe that their kids aren't going to be safe, even if you make assurances that the schools reopen? Anyway,
this is a conundrum, and it's been politicized, and that's unfortunate. I think that education is for children is one of our most important responsibilities, but it's also our responsibility to keep these kids safe. Unless we have a viable cure or a vaccine for this disease, I don't think it's reasonable to allow kids back in school because, I mean, let's face it, they're a petri dish. I mean, they can convey any disease that's around. The sniffles becomes a whole community sniffles. So I don't think today is the day to have these kids back in school until there's some reasonable assurance that they can be safe.
Thank you. I was an elementary K-6 school librarian, a public librarian for the city of Azusa, and a community college librarian for 20 years. And I'm here to say, and I serve in my grandson's elementary schools. And the thought of the protocols being put in place in any of these venues, number one, what this is exposing is how lopsided our education is in general. For example, my elementary school, excellent elementary school across the street, Beechwood, in the kindergarten classes and the first and second grade classes, they've got kids sitting at round tables, 6 kids at each round table, and they're, 2 feet apart. The room is packed.
yes.
How in the world are they going to get 6 feet between students in a room that would accommodate about, I'm thinking maybe 10 students if they all had to be 6 feet apart from everybody else? That's one. The other is none of these people that are advocating open K-6 have been in an elementary school since the 1950s or the 1960s, and they don't understand kids spit on each other. They go out and they roll around in the dirt on recess, and they share food, and they bump into each other. There's just no way that kids, unless we have strict, like isolation, like what we're doing, that we can protect them. And by protecting them, I live with my 2 grandsons. One is a year old and one is 10. If they get the disease, I get the disease. And I'm 74 years old. So I'm not entirely confident that I want to get this disease at this point because it could be a death sentence for me.
Yep.
I'm against the Orange County schools opening, even though I understand and value, and I mean, the most important thing to me in life just about is education. But it's not something I'm prepared to die for just yet.
I just wanted to address the problem of the schools even being able to teach online. I read all about teaching online, learning online. And from what I've seen, there is very little teaching and learning going on online. It seems that the schools were caught flat-footed when they were shut down originally. They never got up to speed. I talked to a lot of kids going to public schools, going to private schools in my neighborhood and among friends. And the kids now who were going to private schools were up and running the next day in their uniforms in front of their computers at 8:30 in the morning till 3:30 in the afternoon. And I think they were actually learning. The public schools, on the other hand, had no plan in place for several weeks. Then they didn't require any face-to-face instruction between the children and the instructors. For the most part, they went to Google Classroom and got their assignments. All they did was do assigned work, and that was it. No instruction on how it should be done. I know my grandson, who's in an AP chemistry class in Long Beach, had one online class, and he was one of 3 who showed up for it. Now I read just recently that the teachers union has negotiated that the teachers will not be required at all to teach online, and they will not be required to work, or they won't be asked to work more than 4 hours a day. And I heard yesterday that Governor Newsom says that the teachers union will determine when schools can open. Is that true at all?
Well, thank you. You presented a lot of things to unpack. Let me not, I don't think I can unpack them all, but one thing to point out, I think there's a lot of stakeholders in public education. And you do have those stakeholders oftentimes have legal rights through contracts, working conditions, terms of employment, compensation that are not just waived in bad times. So I think it shows the great complexity of getting this right in a small entity that maybe you can get everyone aligned, but you still don't know about the public health things. But good things. I think we can all continue our learning on this by looking at sources as they come out to try to get the story. This story will continue throughout this year because our kids are too important to us. We got more to unpack in 2 weeks. The president's task force is going to make their presentation. I think more the president at 2 p.m. our time today. We have a town hall. Well, you heard the session. I'll stay around for a couple 3 minutes after the class, but let's end the class right now. Thank you all. Thank you very much. Well.